Welcome to Storm the Gates, Book 3 of the Rogue Gods Trilogy by Melinda Kucsera.
Part 3, Chapter 9, From the Gray to the Green. Ivarian staggered as the timeline shattered and vanished as the pieces slid through his fingers. At least the shield was back over the library and silhouettes weren't running back and forth from a side door on the main building to the shield. Did we return to the time we started from? That he couldn't tell. God, he was so tired, but he couldn't stop now, not when he was so close to getting revenge on Pristina for everything she did. Ivarian stifled a yawn. We must hurry, because that ex-goddess intended to destroy time, and part of it was already broken. How much would it take to break the rest of it? He didn't want to find out. Morgana scanned the sky instead of answering. Was she looking for the adversary? Ivarian tilted his head back to check too. If he was in imminent danger, then he needed to know so they could do something about it. But the sky was an unbroken expanse of luminous orange again, with not a speck in the sky. Either the flying man with bat wings already landed somewhere, or they'd returned to a time before he appeared. I hope he landed. I don't want to run into him in the gray between. He looked and sounded like a scary guy.
Are you ready to go back to the gray between?
Morgana hugged the star-shaped crystal to her chest. Yes, let's go. Since she didn't let go of the crystal, he grasped her arm. He didn't know if physical contact was necessary for her teleportation spell to include him, but he'd rather not find out the hard way and end up stranded in hell. Since she didn't shake his hand off her arm, then she didn't mind his touch, or she needed it to teleport him.
All right.
Morgana closed her eyes, and hell vanished into the white light that sprang up around them. When the light faded, that gray place surrounded them, but there were no bones, just an elephant steaming toward them. Fog curled out of his trunk, and he trumpeted to summon his herd.
Come on, I don't want to deal with the memory eaters right now.
Morgana spun on her heel and stalked through the knee-high fog toward a hill. A rainbow alighted on its grassy summit as she headed for it.
You can't be here,
the elephant said as Ivarian ran to catch up to Morgana. Only a goddess could run without lifting the hem of her black dress or tripping over it.
That's why we're leaving. That's the mortal veil in front of us, and we're going right through that as soon as we reach it,
Morgana said over her shoulder. She didn't even make sure he followed her. Unfortunately, the memory eater stomped after them, shaking the dusty ground.
You're not supposed to go through that either. Why don't you just teleport out of here? You're an ex-goddess. You can flash yourself back to the mortal world as easily as you can snap your fingers.
Because time doesn't work the same here as it does in the mortal world, and it's less confusing and stressful to just go through that veil because it handles the time dilation for me. If I teleported us, I'm not entirely sure when we'd end up. You know, the shield around this place messes with that kind of thing, and I'm not as powerful as my parents, so it can really mess with my teleportation spells.
Morgana sped up the hill like she had an unlimited reserve of energy. Silence fell as Ivarian digested her explanation. He didn't like it, but what choice did he have? None. Pristina took all his choices away when she embarked on her mad plan. The dust gave way to springy grass as he ran out of steam and walked up the hill. Behind him, the elephant stopped at the base of the hill as if he was also thinking about what she said. Maybe her argument was enough to convince the memory eaters to let them go because the elephant didn't follow them up the hill, or maybe the elephant just didn't want to lumber uphill. Is what you told it true? Ivarian asked as he stopped to catch his breath.
Yes, it's true. I'd have teleported us if I could, but I'm not entirely certain we'd end up where you want us to. If we go through the mortal veil, then we have a chance of ending up where we left off. But it all depends on how much time we spent here and in hell, because as I reminded the memory eater, time doesn't work the same in either place as it does in the mortal world.
She didn't mention the timeline he manipulated while they were in hell, but that probably also had some effect. What are you saying? Ivarian hurried to catch up.
I'm just preparing you for the possibility that we may not arrive back right after you left. Some time will have passed, but I don't know how much.
Nor did that bother Morgana as she strode toward the end of the rainbow at the top of the hill. What if time is already messed up in the mortal world? How will that affect our return? Ivarian stumbled the last few steps to her.
I don't honestly know. We could return years after you left. Anything is possible.
Morgana stopped finally and studied him. Perhaps this was just a thought experiment for her, but it was his life they were talking about. Although what life could he have now? Ivarian put that dark thought out of mind. Morgana and her sisters agreed to help him, and he clung to the hope that they could help his situation. What about before? Could Could we go back to a point in time before we left the mortal world? That would be ideal if it were possible.
That's not how it works. When you leave the gray between, you always end up back in the mortal world later than when you left. It's always later, never earlier. You can never return before you leave. There's some magic here that prevents that.
Morgana turned and trudged the rest of the way to the rainbow. But I am a son of a time goddess. Could I take us back to before we left? Ivarian stood there, caught between hope and fear.
I don't think you should. There's magic here that's beyond my comprehension, and it's set up this way for a reason. We shouldn't mess with it, especially if time is already messed up. Let's not stress it any more than necessary.
Morgana stopped a foot away from where the rainbow met the hill, and it billowed like fabric.
After all, I promised to help you, and so did my sisters. Once you free my mother, I'm sure she'll help you too. With that many of us on your side, I don't think you have anything to worry about.
She winked at him as she stepped into the rainbow and vanished. Wait for me! Ivarian reached the top, and the rainbow slammed into him, knocking him back. No! I don't want to return to that weird gray place. As he fell, the world darkened. When Ivarian opened his eyes, he lay on the leaf-covered ground, and enchanted trees towered over Morgana. She sat beside him, still holding the star-shaped crystal like it was the most precious thing in the world. The trees were green and growing, and the air didn't hurt his face or his lungs. The ground wasn't cold either, and the snow must have melted away. There was no glowing shield, no ex-gods except Morgana, and no haven. How long were we gone? Ivarian sat up, and no dizziness assaulted him. Neither did exhaustion. Perhaps that rainbow restored some of his energy. Anything was possible when it came to magic.
I don't know. I'm not as tethered to this world as you are, so I don't even know how to find out.
She shrugged like that was of no consequence. I do. Ivarian remembered Rand saying something about living under Mount Erdren his whole life. I need to find someone. Rand was so chatty that he'd tell anyone his age, if asked, because it was something to talk about, and that's what he wanted. Where was Mount Erdren? It shouldn't be too hard to find, since it was on the Nerfall River just outside of the capital district. He just needed to find the Nerfall River, and anyone sailing on it could tell him if he was east or west of it. Then he could just take the ferry, but that might take a day of hiking or more. Did he want to spend that much time doing that? Was there an easier way? Ivarian studied Morgana, but she didn't look tired or spent, so perhaps all that teleporting she did already had no effect on her. Can you teleport us to Mount Erdren?
I don't know. I've never been there. It's hard to go somewhere I can't picture. If I could see it, or if you had something from there that I could use as a sympathetic link, then I could try. Without that, we're better off walking.
She tried again, like she didn't really care where she went now that she had the crystal. There was still the arrow of time. He could take her there, and perhaps the images in the ice crystals would give her enough of a picture of the place to teleport them. But he remembered it breaking apart on his last trip. No, it's better if I don't stress it. Besides, I can figure this out myself. I learned some forest craft at my father's knee, his human father. Ivarian rose and checked the enchanted trees for the blue-green moss that grew on the trees within a mile of the river. When he found it, he waved to Morgana to join him.
What did you find?
She rose and dusted off the back of her skirt before padding over to him. Something that will lead me to someone who can tell me where and when we are. Come on. Ivarian wound through the foliage under the trees, finding bushes and grasses that like to grow near water, and they confirmed he headed in the right direction. Ivarian stood on a cliff so high above the broad expanse of the river he could see only tiny dark shapes on it, but not what they were.
What's down there?
Morgana peered over the edge, then backed away when she saw how far down the rocky shore was. I hope that's the river Nerfall. Ivarian tried to estimate its width and gave up when he could barely see the other side. It must be the Nerfall. It's the only river in the country that gets that wide, and the current flowed west to east under a sunny blue sky, just like the Nerfall River. But were they east or west of Mount Erdren? When one goes through that rainbow thing, do they end up where they were before they went to the Gray Between? He hoped so, because that haven was somewhere close enough for Rand's father to hike to it from Mount Erdren.
Yes, mortals do, because just their soul goes to the Gray Between. So when they go through the mortal veil, the rainbow, they return to their bodies. But you and I are immortal, so we can physically go to the Gray Between as if it were another city. So we return to somewhere close to where we left the mortal world, but we could be miles away from that spot.
She shrugged again, like none of this still bothered her. Maybe it didn't matter to her. She might be so used to this by now that it didn't faze her. After all, she could be thousands of years old at this point, not a woman in her early 20s like she appeared.
Do you want to go down to the river? I can flash us there in an instant. It's no problem.
Morgana nodded to the cliff, but she didn't approach it. Maybe she didn't like heights. That would be great, thank you, because there should be plenty of boats sailing past, and he could hail one and ask where Mount Erdren was, but that won't work from up here.
Sure, it beats climbing down and risking a broken bone.
She snapped snapped her fingers like the memory eater suggested earlier, and the cliff disappeared. When the light faded again, they stood on the rocky beach. Ivarian crouched and cupped his hands to scoop the cold water into his thirsty mouth.
You can drink straight from the river?
Morgana sat on a low boulder and rested the crystal on her lap so she could dip her fingers in the cool water too. Yes, it's fresh water, and there are plants in the river that keep it clean. Ivarian drank some more water from his hands until a reflection on the water caught his attention. He straightened and waved both hands to get the fisherman in the boat to notice him. "Excuse me, do you know where Mount Eredren is?"
Yeah, it's just a few miles down that way.
The fisherman pointed eastward.
Could you take us there?
Morgana rose and cradled the crystal in her arms again.
We'd pay you for your time, of course.
"I don't have any money." Ivarian glanced at her in surprise. Could she manifest coins out of thin air? Maybe she could. After all, she was a full goddess.
I do. Will this be enough?
Morgana juggled the crystal so she held it in the crook of one arm, then plunged her hand into her pocket. When she removed it, gold coins rested on her palm, and she offered them to the wide-eyed fisherman.
For that, lady, I'd row you to Jacora.
The fisherman shook his head as he rowed toward them. "That's okay, we just need to reach Mount Eredren." Ivarian grabbed the side of the boat and pulled it closer before helping Morgana aboard. She was as good as her word and handed over the coins before sitting on the bottom of the boat since there was no bench for her. Ivarian shivered as an icy wind struck the back of his neck. "I just need to find Ran and everything will be fine," he told himself, but the cold fear that he was too late to make a difference gnawed at him. As he sat between Morgana and the fisherman, there was no spare oar, so he spent the hour trying not to think about anything.
Chapter 10. Where Will You Lead Them? Guerren hummed a marching song, since he couldn't remember the words. Maybe it didn't have words. Not every song needed lyrics, but he did enjoy a rousing chorus. Perhaps this song had words, and he'd forgotten them. After all, a long time passed since his days of leading a march. But what days those were. Ahead, the army ran like they had somewhere they needed to reach right now. I guess her speech was more rousing than I thought. It certainly fired them up, and they showed no signs of slowing as they ran through the never-ending fog covering the ground. The gray between couldn't go on forever, so it must have an end somewhere. Why did that end have to be so far away, though? A tangled forest appeared, but thorny vines wrapped around trees bearing sharp leaves, and none of the demons or fallen angels fell out of line to enter it. The creepy forest ended, and a field of bones appeared, also on his left. Nothing appeared on his right, but the fog was thicker over there and piled higher, like it hid something. What could possibly exist here that was worth hiding? Guerren couldn't think of anything as his legs grew tired and complained about all the running he did since listening to the sleeping angel. I wonder what became of her. I haven't heard from her since I went through the gateway. Was she even real? Maybe I imagined her. She could be a figment of my imagination, created by the ex-goddess of fate or chance, just to push me along on some plan they had. Well, he could find out if he ever went back to hell, since he only saw her there. How much further will they run before they rest? Because I could use a rest right now. Guerren wished he was in better condition, but he was in hell for a long time without his powers, stuck in a cell and subject to whatever the fallen angels wanted to do to him. That wasn't conducive to maintaining good physical conditioning or stamina. Before the fall, his magic kept him in perfect shape, and he didn't know how to build his stamina back up without it. But there must be a way, since other beings were in great shape too. They must have done something to achieve that. Well, not the angels. They were made to be strong in mind and body, so their physical condition couldn't change, because it was part of their intrinsic nature. Guerren almost tripped over his feet when something finally appeared in front of him, besides a long swath of fog. A dark, rounded thing poked out of the fog, and a bunch of short things rose from its top. From here, they looked like hair, but that's probably not what they were. Please tell me there aren't any giants in the gray between. If there were, he'd never heard of it, but he didn't pay any attention to the stories about the gray between before he ended up there. Now that he saw it, he wouldn't seek them out either. I don't recommend this place. It's too damned foggy and gray. Even the sky was gray and looked on the verge of a downpour that never fell. Those heavy clouds just lingered, like the fog, spreading dark vibes. Abandon all hope, all those who enter here. They should write that on a sign and stick it where you enter. The army charged up the rounded thing, so it must be a hill. A rainbow began at the hill's top and arched through the thick clouds, but its other end wasn't anywhere in the gray between. I wonder where that rainbow goes. Maybe I'll find out.
You need to run faster if you want to catch that army.
Natalie said, but the Versati wasn't behind him. Unless they were invisible, could their kind cast an invisibility spell? Who says I need to catch them? They're already mine. They just don't know it yet. Guerren glanced around, but there was still no one around, just the army about a mile or so ahead. I hear you, but I don't see you. Where are you?
Look up, we're above you.
Indeed, the Versati was, nor were they alone. You brought Uriah with you. Guerren didn't know what to make of that. Uriah could return to Hell whenever he wanted, so why did he stick around? Hell was his former home. Before it became Hell, Arginil followed Natalie and Uriah, but the angel didn't glance at him or wave hello. If Guerren didn't know any better, he'd think the angel was preoccupied. Was he wondering what he'd find in heaven? Probably. I would wonder if I were him, but Guerren wasn't him. So instead of wondering about heaven, he wished the army would slow down or stop for a minute, but they didn't. They ran up the hill and disappeared over its top as the rainbow rose until it just ended in the middle of the sky. Maybe it didn't like demons or fallen angels. Anything was possible here. You could give my legs a break and carry me. Guerren stopped to catch his breath.
I could do that, but I'm already carrying someone.
Natalie flew past him. Okay, so they couldn't pick him up. What about the angel? Arginil didn't say anything, but he extended his hand as he slowed. Guerren seized that hand and held on for dear life as the angel lifted him off the ground. Well, hello to you too, your pensiveness. Guerren reached up and grabbed hold with his other hand too, and he grinned when his boots cut through the fog. At least he wasn't running anymore. But his arm ached, since it wasn't meant to hold his weight, as he dangled by it. Arginil didn't notice. He just flew onward, but his grip was firm. Guerren pulled his knees into his chest as the ground rose toward the top of the hill. Hey, Gray Between, to Arginil, could you fly higher? Arginil finally glanced at him and nodded as he angled upward. Guerren let his legs dangle above the hilltop, then his heels touched down on it. Are we landing? Guerren asked, even though that's what it looked like. Natalie also stood on the grassy hilltop with Uriah.
What are we looking at?
The Versati waved their gloved hand to take in the white sandy beach and the blue water that stretched into a shimmering line in the distance. We're looking at a beach. I thought that was obvious. I'd like to know why we stopped. Guerren looked back and forth between his friends, then settled on Natalie, because they were doing all the talking right now.
I landed because the air felt heavy and it made flying harder, but I might just be tired from using too much energy.
Natalie lifted both hands, then let them fall, like it didn't matter to them which it was.
Heaven lies on the other side of that sea.
Arginil pointed at the shimmering line and the giant shadow moving toward it.
Is that a boat?
Uriah peered at the shape as it reached the shining line.
Yes, there's only one boat, and it's not here.
Arginil stared at that boat like it was a sight for sore eyes. And it probably was, since he grew up in heaven. So, you're saying that Lionestra and her army have nowhere to go? Guerren rubbed his chin and thought. The stop made sense now. They gathered here to plan their next move.
Unless they want to double back and run through the Gray Between, yes, that's what I'm saying. But that's what we need them to do, because there's a doorway somewhere around here that leads to hell. I just don't know where it is.
And that bothered Arginil enough to put a twist in his robes. The poor angel. How do you know it exists? Have you seen it? Guerren shifted his weight. He wanted to go after that army, not stand here and talk tactics. I should just go. I don't need any help to claim an army. Once a war god, always one. So I just need to go take command. The right words and deeds would occur to him at the right moment, as they always had. That was his nature, to command, not to stand here and speculate. His friends could do that well enough on their own. They didn't need him for that. Why should I remain here?
I could feel it. There's a place in the sky where the barrier over hell thins. I didn't know what it was then, but I know now. That thin spot is a doorway, and the door must be here because of the nature of the Gray Between.
Arginil said as Guerren walked down the opposite side of the hill.
Where are you going?
Natalie called after him. I'm getting my army, but you should find that door to hell while I do that. Guerren whistled a jaunty tune as he hiked down the hill.
What will you do with that army after you take command?
Arginil appeared in front of him, forcing Guerren to stop or plow into him. The angel was handsome beyond all reason, but he was also as moody as hell, so Guerren stopped. I'll lead it, of course. That's what a general does, and once he claimed that army, he'd be a general again.
Where will you lead it?
Arginil folded his arms and planted his sandal-shod feet. Not even the breeze stirring his dark hair or his white robes could soften his scowl or his demeanor. I'll just lead it. Guerren ran a hand through his equally dark hair.
You'll lead it to where? Answer me.
Why do I need to answer that? I don't have the army yet, so I don't need to figure that out. Guerren tried to go around Arginil, but that damned angel stepped in front of him again, and he'd already lost one fight to this angel. No way would Guerren repeat that without an army at his back, especially not this close to heaven and the source of Arginil's power.
If we find the door that leads to hell, will you lead the army through it?
Natali skidded to a stop and faced Guerren. Would he? Guerren stared at the demons in the last row as they vanished around a bend in the shore. I need to catch them and turn them to my leadership.
Will you do it?
Arginil grasped his upper arms and shook Guerren, forcing him to look at the angel in his glowing violet eyes.
This is important. I need to know you'll do the right thing.
And if I won't? Guerren stared at the angel's nose, so he wouldn't be drawn into those eyes. All angels could gaze into one's soul, and some were powerful enough to bring you along for the ride. No, thank you. I know what's in my soul.
Then you'll become my enemy.
Arginil released him.
But we'll avoid that, right, Guerren? You'll lead the army to the door to hell and encourage them to exit the gray between so we can all remain friends.
Natali clapped a hand on his shoulder and one on the scowling angel's shoulder, too. Of course I will. I was just joking with you. Guerren forced himself to grin, even though a storm brewed inside him. Hell was the last place he wanted to go, and he'd fight anyone who tried to send him there.
There you see, he agreed. So, how do we find the doorway in question?
Natali patted his shoulder, then removed their hand.
You ask someone who knows,
said a woman, as an elephant marched toward them, puffing gray smoke out of her trunk.
Who are you?
Natali turned to regard the newcomer and took their gaze off him. Arginil stepped aside as well and strode toward the elephant.
She's a memory eater. Her kind protects and maintains the gray between.
Guerren backed slowly down the hill until his friends fell into conversation with the elephant. Then he turned and sprinted for the beach. The hill seemed longer on this side, but he finally stepped on sand and skipped toward the outcropping behind which the army disappeared not that long ago. I'm coming to get you. Wait for me, my new comrades. Together we shall conquer.
Chapter 11. A Lecture to Remember.
He left.
Natali whispered when the elephant paused their lecture about how demons and ex-gods didn't belong in the gray between. At least the memory eater confirmed the doorway to hell existed before launching into that speech. I know. Arginil suppressed a sigh. He knew Guerren would leave the moment they took their eyes off him, so that wasn't a surprise. Neither was the location of the portal to hell. He didn't need the memory eater to tell him it was in that boneyard they passed. He smelled the brimstone and saw the smoke rising from within it, and it was an appropriate place for such a portal. I'll take full responsibility for them for as long as they're in the gray between. Arginil cut in when the lecture went on and on without an end in sight.
you take responsibility for the one that left?
The memory eater stomped her feet. Did he want that responsibility? No, but this creature wouldn't stop haranguing them until he agreed, so he nodded and hoped that promise wouldn't come back to bite him in the end.
Will we have to fight him?
Natali asked as she edged away from the elephant. I don't know. Do you want to? Arginil didn't want it to come to that, but he couldn't let an army sack heaven. They can't reach it. Heaven is safe, but the irrational fear that they could somehow go there lingered like a foul taste in his mouth.
At first I did, but thanks to him, I've had a grand adventure and made some new friends along the way, so I guess I don't want to smack him anymore.
Natali gave the elephant the side eye, so perhaps that goodwill didn't extend to memory eaters.
You're not listening, so I'll cut the lecture short. Hell is that way. If you know what's good for you, Angel, you'll take your friends to the door and toss them out.
The elephant pointed toward the boneyard in the distance, confirming his guess. Then the creature stomped down the other side of the hill and left them alone. Thank the stars. I thought that pompous creature would never leave. Uriah stretched his arms over his head. He looked better, so perhaps Natali recharged his magical reserves.
Me either. Let's go before she returns with her herd in tow.
Natali looped her arm through through his and towed him down the hill.
Where did our army-obsessed war god go?
He probably went around that bend in more ways than one. Did you hear how crazy he sounded? Seeing that army did something to his mind.
Uriah pointed at the rock formation in question. Maybe his natural instinct surfaced. That could also explain his hyperfixation. Arginil hoped that's all it was. If it wasn't just his nature asserting itself, then they might have a bigger problem. I guess we'll find out soon enough which it is.
Where's Thaniel?
Natalie glanced around as they stepped onto the sand. I guess she crossed the sea already. Otherwise, we'd see her. Arginil glanced at the silhouette of a ship on the horizon, but all he could see was its boxy hind end as it transitioned through that shimmering line and disappeared. That line must be the border between the gray between and the realm of heaven. Who else was on that ship with her? A name hovered on his lips. Are you on that ship too, Azariah? I hope you are, so you don't see me or the wretch I've become. Arginil fixed his eyes on the rocks ahead and the narrow strip of sand that wound around them, and he stared so hard at them he ignored the brown object in his peripheral vision until Natali turned and pointed at it.
What is that thing?
Natali patted his arm to get his attention. Arginil didn't want to stop and look at anything, but Natali dug her heels in and refused to give him a choice. He turned and closed his eyes for a moment, not wanting to see, but he steeled himself and then he stared too. What in the name of heaven is that?
I think it was some kind of boat, but not one I've ever seen.
Uriah shook his head.
I didn't think they made them that large.
Me either. Arginil shook his head too, but denying what he saw didn't change it. Clearly the demons, the fallen angels, and the ex-gods pooled their power to change the boat because it was 10 times larger than it should be, with more decks than he'd ever seen before. The ship's superstructure towered over them until a giant wave slammed into its rear, and the ship shot forward far faster than something that size should move, especially with its decks crammed with cheering passengers.
Where did they get that thing from?
Natali slid their arm free and padded toward the water. I don't know. I didn't think there were any more boats. There was only one when I was here last, and that one ship only sailed when Azariah did things to make it sail. Arginil couldn't remember the words for those things, but he remembered Azariah hauling on lines and doing things to the sails so they caught the wind. But Azariah's boat was 10 times smaller than the one the demon army commandeered. As he stood there, he saw Azariah wave, then sail away from heaven on some errand for some angel. I watched until you vanished into the spot where the blue sky met the blue sea, and I never saw you again. That memory was as sharp and as clear as a glass shard. After that, his memories grew dark and distorted until a voice broke through that darkness and told him to build a library and put all the dangerous things inside it. In his next clear memory, he laid the cornerstone for the library's main keep-like structure.
Hey, are you okay?
Natali touched his shoulder gently. Yeah, I was just remembering something from before. Arginil carefully folded up that memory and placed it in a box in the back of his mind to look at later. Right now, he needed to focus, not pine away after lost friends.
So are we just going to fly after it?
Uriah stepped into the surf, then backed away and scowled at it.
Yeah, that's the only plan we've got right now, but I'm not sure how we get all the passengers off the boat and over to the portal back to hell. Anyone have any ideas about that?
Natali glanced between them. We'd have to turn the boat around and get it back to shore first. Then we could work on herding them toward the portal. I wish we had help. Arginil glanced around, but there was no one else on the beach except them. Somewhere in this strange realm, a herd of memory eaters went about their work, but he couldn't think of a way they could help or an argument to convince them to try. Unfortunately, the gray between didn't exist as a separate realm before he went to hell, so he didn't know if there was anyone else here or how to find them.
Me too, but we crossed a large port of this place and didn't find anyone except Guerren. Where's that ex-war god?
Uriah rounded the rocks that had tumbled down onto the beach some time ago and peered at the beach beyond them.
He's not there. Did he get aboard?
Must have if you don't see him. Is he a passenger or their new commander?
Natali extruded a set of wings from their back as they gazed at the ship speeding away from them, but they were feathered like his own. Let's not worry about that right now. When we catch up to that ship, we can figure that out. Arginil walked to the edge of the beach and let the water wash over his sandals. It was an odd sensation as the cold water slid between his toes and the sand sucked at his sandals.
Right, they're getting away and we need to stop them. Come on, it's time to fly.
Natali extended their hand to Uriah.
Do you want to ride or are you planning to hang out on the beach while we do all the work?
more. Their veil covered most of their face, but the Versatis' glowing pink eyes crinkled like they were smiling.
Sure, why not? I'm enjoying my trip so far to this strange gray place. Why not extend it?
Uriah clasped her hand. Natalie pulled him close and wrapped an arm around him.
Are you ready to go?
Yeah, let's get this over with. Arginil flapped his wings and lifted off the ground. But he took one last glance at the beach and the hill where they lost Guerren, just in case the ex-war god missed the boat. But Guerren didn't run out and demand a lift. Instead, one end of the rainbow lowered until it touched the top of the hill again, crowning it with every color imaginable, and it shimmered like a portal. Where do you lead? Somewhere in the gray between, there was a portal to the mortal world. Was he looking at it? Arginil shelved his curiosity. Who cared where the portal to the mortal world was? I'll never go there, so I don't need to know. He just needed to fly. So he turned toward heaven and chased that ship of demons until the air shimmered and a shudder ran through him. Light burst from his fingers and toes as he fell toward a black chasm that appeared in the sea below him.
Arginil, what's happening? Are you okay?
Natalie shouted, and she probably swooped toward him, but he couldn't speak. Light slammed into him. Then he struck something large and scaly. Light poured out of every piece of him, turning him into a man-shaped sun, and still more light crowded in until he felt like he'd burst. A deep, rumbly voice said something about a no-fly zone as he lay there, blinded by light. Maybe I can't cross the boundary after all. Maybe I really am damned. He had no more tears to cry as the world turned black.
Chapter 12, not dropping any eaves.
I'd like to see him one last time,
Istiana said, and she sounded so sad. Bran shut his mouth and put his shock aside and stared at the trees dropping leaves on the grass, then beyond them to the enchanted trees standing beyond them at the edge of the snowy field surrounding this spot. This was a strange place indeed, and that was saying something since he lived in a country covered in enchanted trees. How did a circle of green trees and grass land in the middle of a clearing covered in several feet of snow? The truth probably wasn't something simple. It never was when magic was involved. As the son of a powerful mage who liked to keep secrets, he spent a good portion of his childhood in a state of shock, surprise, or confusion. But so did Papa. Istiana must love a Varian as much as Papa loves me, and that Rand could understand. But he didn't know how he could help. Papa could find people with a thought and a wave of his hand, although the hand waving wasn't necessary. But I don't have location-based magic. In fact, his magic didn't care where he was.
I don't know where he is, but I can find him after we make the swap and find out if that saves your life, because right now, that's my top priority. You're my favorite sister, and I don't want to lose you.
Rand still couldn't wrap his mind around that revelation, nor did he glance at her. He didn't want to see what she was doing, so he kept his back to her in case she already started the crystal swap.
I'm your only sister right now since Pristina is gone.
Istiana coughed. Bran opened his mouth to ask who Pristina was and what happened to her, then he closed his mouth. One shock was enough. He didn't need to know about any other ex-gods.
Yeah, but you were my favorite before that, too.
Faye said, and she sounded sincere. Ren still didn't look. He could stand the sight of blood without fainting or doing anything dramatic, but he didn't want to know what color ex-gods bled, or if they bled at all. No, thank you. I can live without that information. Besides, such information could be bad for his health if the ex-gods decided they didn't want him to have it. I should go far away from here so that won't happen.
I think it could work,
said the angel, holding Rosalie.
I anchored the present to Rosalie by shoving Pristina's time crystal into her chest. Since he didn't cease to exist, I assume that worked.
So that was how Rosalie got that wound in her chest. But if he was understanding their conversation right, and that was a big if at this point since shock still fogged his mind, then what did that make his friend? Is Rosalie a goddess now?
She's immortal, if that's what you're asking, so I guess that makes her like a goddess.
The angel looked at him with compassion in her violet eyes.
Then I'd better get to work. Anyone got a knife?
Faye asked, and it felt like she glared at his back. Did she expect him to wander around armed? Well, she had the wrong mage if that was her assumption. Besides, I don't need weapons. Rand didn't turn or glance at her. The ex-goddess could stare at his back all she wanted, but that wouldn't change the facts. Before you cut her up, I need to go. I came to help Rosalie, and she got all the help I can give her. Rand rose and walked over to his too quiet uncle. Can someone tell me how to get us back to where we belong? Now he had to turn around because he asked a question, and he needed to see the reaction it produced.
What's the hurry? You're awfully handy to have around given the rare type of magic you possess.
Faye studied him like she was figuring out where to slot him into her plans. Uh-oh, that wasn't a good sign. We had some unexpected visitors and they damaged some stuff. I should go home and clean it up. Rand jerked his thumb over his shoulder, even though he didn't know where home was in relation to here. Calling the demons unexpected visitors stretched the truth a bit, but his magic didn't care much about that. It just sat quietly within him, waiting for a wish to make true.
You can do that later.
Faye raised a finger when he protested that now was a fantastic time to get started.
I wasn't finished.
Faye squinted at the sky.
You're currently about 20 years in the past. Unless you can time travel, you're stuck here until I take you home. After all, I'm the goddess of the future and fate too, so you better not make me angry.
The last part left her lips as a growl that raised his hackles. Okay, when you put it like that, what choice do we have? Rand glanced at his uncle, and Uncle Mirren squeezed his arm. They were in this together, and that was comforting. Rand took strength from that touch and pushed on. He needed one thing first, then he could agree to her request. But I need you to promise something.
You don't need anything from me, mortal.
Faye seemed to swell, and her body blurred as she became dragon-like. Was she a dragon, or did she cast an illusion of one over herself? Perhaps now wasn't the time to ask that, so Rand kept his mouth shut. He was in enough trouble right now.
Now who's being unreasonable?
Istiana glared up at her sister from where she lay on the cold ground when she slid off Faye's lap.
And you, sister, you can do him one small favor. What do you need?
Promise me that I won't run into a younger version of my father, my uncle, my aunt, Rosalie's mom, Rosalie or myself. In fact, can we stay away from Mount Eredrin too? I can handle the whole time travel thing as long as I don't need to deal with anything that reminds me that I'm not in my rightful place in time. Rand didn't think that was an unreasonable request, so maybe she'd agree?
I'd like the same promise. Time travel is nice to think about, but I don't want to interact with younger versions of myself or my family either.
Uncle Mirren put in, and that was understandable. But Rand had to get one last dig in. This is because I said you'd have to deal with them, right?
Yeah, the more I thought about it, the less I wanted to deal with past versions of us.
Uncle Mirren squeezed his shoulder again.
Well, sister, what do you say? It doesn't sound like an unreasonable request to me.
Sienna stared at her sister and raised one eyebrow. She must be the older sister since she gave off older sibling energy. The byplay reminded Rand of his father and uncle. They often traded barbed comments, especially when they wanted each other to do something and the other didn't want to do it. Faye shrank back down until she was a lot shorter than Rand and nodded as the scales retracted, making her look human again.
That doesn't sound too difficult. All right, you've got a deal.
Thank you. We'll just be over here where we can't see what you're doing. Rand pointed at a stand of trees near Rosalie and led his uncle to them. Hopefully that would be far enough to avoid seeing anything too unpleasant.
I'd better help you.
The angel set Rosalie gently on the ground.
Will you watch over her while I help them?
Of course.
Uncle Mirren said when the angel glanced at them.
Thank you. Call me if there's any change.
She walked away to join the ex-gods on the dirt. Maybe she had a better way to save the dying ex-goddess.
Now what?
Uncle Mirren asked in an undertone when she was out of earshot. Although, were angels ever really out of earshot? We're not sticking around. I still have a time crystal. I can try wishing us home. Rand pulled the crystal out of his pocket.
Are you sure that'll work? What if she put a hex on us to keep us from doing that? After all, she said she was the ex-goddess of the future, so wouldn't she already know what you're planning?
Uncle Mirren leaned against a tree and rubbed his upper arms. It was getting cold and they weren't dressed for the weather. I don't know. I don't have time magic and I don't understand how we ended up here in the first place, but we must do something. We can't just stand around and wait for the ex-gods to give us orders. Well, Rand couldn't. He probably wouldn't like what they asked him to do anyway. All the more reason to get out of there while the ex-gods were distracted.
Rand, is that you I hear?
Rosalie asked, but she sounded hoarse, like she lost her voice when she acquired that wound in her chest. Yeah, it's me, and Uncle Mirren is here too. Rand shoved the time crystal back into his pocket and crouched beside her. The wound was gone, leaving just dried blood that flaked off her pale skin as she shifted on the cold ground.
I thought so. Why is it so cold? Aren't we still in the haven?
Rosalie rubbed her forehead, then froze.
Oh, right. The shield around the haven exploded. Everything's a bit blurry after that. Did I stop Pristina from destroying all of time?
I don't know. She wasn't here when we arrived. Who's Pristina? Rand hoped he wouldn't regret asking that question, but he probably would because Pristina had something to do with the ex-gods. From what he overheard, she might even be Faye's sister.
She's the ex-goddess of the present. Help me up. I need to find her and make sure she doesn't break time.
Rosalie grabbed his hand and yanked it. I don't think you should get up yet. You were hurt bad when we arrived. Rand tried to tug his hand free, but she clung to it like his hand was was a lifeline.
I'm sore, but I should be since I got knocked around a bit. Help me up.
Rosalie extended her other hand to Uncle Mirren, but his uncle backed out of range, so he must think it was a bad idea for her to get up and shamble around.
You should lie down for a while longer. The demon said you'd recover, but he didn't give us a time frame for that.
What demon, Ran? What did you do?
Rosalie glared at him, and a red liquid flowed over her eyes from her top lash line to her bottom one. Rand shot to his feet and backed away because that just wasn't normal. Why do you think I did something?
Because I know you. So tell me what you did.
Rosalie finally struggled up to a sitting position, and the red left her eyes, returning them to their normal appearance with a white part and a black spot in the middle of her brown irises. Well, why don't you start by telling us what you did? A scowling angel woman said you're immortal now because she anchored the present to you by shoving someone named Pristina's time crystal into you. Rand pointed at the spot between Rosalie's breasts as the last flecks of blood fell off, leaving no trace of the wound that was there just an hour ago.
She did what? Help me up.
Rosalie reached for his hand again. Oh no, I think you should sit there and tell us what's going on. Rand folded his arms and tucked his hands into his armpits to warm them.
You'd better hope she was lying. Because if she's not, and you don't help me up right now, I'll make your past a living hell, Randall.
As Rosalie glared at him, an opaque red film covered her eyes again. Rand shivered, but not from the cold or the wind. How did you know that's my real name? I never tell anyone it, and I know Papa didn't tell you because he just calls me Ran. Besides, he doesn't usually introduce me. I jump in and handle that because he would avoid giving out his name and mine and let people wonder what our names are.
I think you missed the point.
Uncle Mirren clasped his shoulder and squeezed it. That's possible. I often digress. Rand slipped a hand into his pocket and squeezed the time crystal, then let it go with a suppressed sigh because he couldn't leave now. Things were just getting interesting, and he really did come to help Rosalie. Since she was awake now, that mission was back on track. All right, I'll help you up before you stare a hole through me. Do you have to do that creepy eye thing?
What creepy eye thing?
Rosalie touched the area around her eyes as the red film faded. Never mind, give me your hand. The angel woman is helping the ex-gods swap time crystals. If you want to talk to them, then you'd better hurry. Rand grasped her hands when she reached for him and pulled her to her feet easily enough, but he held on for a moment until she stopped swaying.
Why are they swapping time crystals?
Rosalie planted her feet and locked her knees. That stopped her from swaying, but she still looked like death was deciding whether to claim her or not. Her lips were colorless, and her cheeks too, and that was weird in the cold weather. I didn't understand the reason for that. It had something to do with saving one of the ex-gods. Rand let go of her hands, but she didn't let go of him.
I need to talk to them. Come on.
When Rosalie staggered away, she tried to pull him along in her wake, but Rand dug his heels in. No, thank you. You can talk to them on your own and tell us what you find out.
Are you squeamish? I didn't think a little blood could upset you.
Rosalie tugged his hand. I'm not. I won't faint at the sight of blood, but I'm trying not to see something that could get me into deep trouble later.
We probably know too much already.
Uncle Myron patted his shoulder, then strode past him. What kind of nephew would I be if I let him face the ex-gods alone? A bad one, and I'm definitely not that. Besides, today would be a bad day to quit eavesdropping, and this time he had an invitation to do it. Okay, fine, we'll come with you. But I'm not watching them cut holes in each other. I draw the line there. Rand quit digging his heels in and let her drag him toward the oblong boulder that looked kind of like an altar and the large circle of dirt surrounding it that was covered with symbols and footprints.
You've been listening to Storm the Gates, Book 3 of the Rogue Gods Trilogy by Melinda Kucsera. Subscribe to the channel so you'll be notified when the next part publishes. The Rogue Gods Trilogy is available as an ebook and paperback, and now a full cast audiobook. Click the link in the description to order your copy. If you love the Rogue Gods Trilogy, then you'll love Melinda's other epic fantasy adventure books too. They're just as full of magic and mayhem and characters who will do anything to achieve their goals. Check them out at the link in the description, and while you're there, sign up for her newsletter so her characters can talk directly to you. Thank you for listening.